Start recording in another second. Now we're recording. And we're going to move on to the next teaching of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. We discussed the whole issue of, at least we discussed parts of the issue about his teaching about women being obligated to read the Megillah. That sounds like a very inclusive idea. There was pushback in the tradition to limit the ability of women to participate. Shocking, I know, to many of us. That was a joke. And this discussion of how equal women's participation is in Megillah, and then of course by extension in all of Judaism, continues to be a discussion to this very moment. Now we're going to come back to a less controversial, less laden topic, but it's again a Purim topic, and we're in the middle of the right-hand column of 4A1. Okay, another teaching from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. It's the middle paragraph, the third paragraph on that column. And I would love it if somebody would step up to read it. It helps me. Anybody going to do that for us? Going once, going twice.
I'll read.
Okay, go ahead.
And Stuart, why don't you read? You haven't read for a while.
Okay. Another teaching from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi also said, women are obligated in the reading of the Megillah.
We did that. No, we did that.
Oh, sorry. Another teaching from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi also said, if Purim falls on Shabbat, in which case the Megillah is read at an earlier date, we must nevertheless inquire into and hold lectures on the subject matter of the day, namely Purim on Shabbat. Okay. So this is part of what we've already discussed. We've pushed away the reading of the Megillah on Shabbat. We'll get to more of a discussion about that later. So if Purim happens to fall on Shabbat, which, by the way, it cannot fall anymore on Shabbat, when we established a mathematically determined calendar as opposed to the calendar that used to be operating based on eyewitnesses, and there was a lot more wiggle room about when things could happen. But when we decided to establish, when we were forced by the church to give up having a court to decide our calendar, then we had to make a perpetual calendar, which we have to this day. And things were worked out systematically, and Purim can no longer fall on Shabbat. But back in the old days, it was possible for it to fall on Shabbat, but then we wouldn't read Megillah on Shabbat. So now what Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is saying is, well, what's the status of that Shabbat? If we're not reading Megillah on Purim, and of course we already had this thing that there are this kind of like wiggle room of when to read the Megillah itself, and we make it possible to read it on other dates besides the 14th, then what's the status of that day per se? Do we have to commemorate Purim on that day in other ways? So here he says that even though we're not reading the Megillah on Purim because it's Shabbat, nevertheless, we have to engage in some kind of, it says here, sho'alim v'dorshim. Sho'alim means you ask questions, and dorshim means you have public lectures about Purim. So it means some kind of study and inquiry is, according to Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, something that is essential to the day. Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit by continuing in the Gemara. The Gemara asks, why mention specifically Purim? This ruling applies even to Yom Tov as well, as it was taught in a Baraisa. Moses established for the Jews the practice of inquiring into and holding lectures on the subject matter of the day, the laws of Pesach on Pesach, the laws of Shavuot on Shavuot, and the laws of Sukkot on Sukkot.
Okay. So we have a tradition that says that when we observe holidays, the way to observe those holidays is also by study privately and publicly. So it's not just that we have certain prayers that we recite on that particular day. It's not just that on Pesach we eat matzah and then Sukkot we sit in a sukkah. It's not just these practical ritual practices, but also we are meant to delve into the significance, the lore, the traditions, the meanings, and the all of the questions that can come up to really get a better grasp of the holiday. That's part of celebrating the holiday as ordained by Moses. So this is, by calling it Moses, it's interesting. It's not from God. It's not from Sinai. But Moses decided that this was necessary for the people. We just finished looking at a little bit at Pirkei Avot, and we avoided discussing the first Mishnah again. But this is part of the idea that is an essential concept in Rabbinic Judaism, that studying Torah is indispensable to living a Jewish life. We're going eventually we're going to get to a teaching in Pirkei Avot that says that an ignorant person cannot be pious. That it's impossible to be ignorant and also really pious. Lo hamaharetz chasid. So, because the dimensions of religious living to be truly enriched need to be from a place of inquiry and understanding. And understanding is not necessarily just an intellectual, informational thing. The whole engagement of delving and discovering new things is part of this culture that was developed by the rabbis. And the rabbis say this goes back all the way. This is so essential to Judaism that we ascribe it to Moses himself as saying that you need to do this as part of your practice. We're coming up to Shavuot in less than 2 weeks. And of course, we have the beautiful custom of a tikkun leil Shavuot, of studying Torah the night before we ritually celebrate the acceptance of the Torah, right? In normal times, we would study all night on the first night of Shavuot. Next day, we have morning prayers, and we read the Torah, the 10 Commandments, and we reimagine ourselves standing at Mount Sinai. And the whole night of study is a preparation for that reenactment, for that imaginative ritual reenactment of standing at Sinai. So and that's a residue, or that's one particular place where this became really entrenched. But this teaching is broadened to be for all of these holidays. So what the Gemara now says is, so what's the big deal of saying that you have to do it on Purim? Of course you have to do it on Purim. That's part of the essential practice that we have for all holidays. All holidays require that we dig in and understand them and study them as part of enjoying that holiday. And of course, to say the obvious, this is predicated on the idea that they believe that studying is a joyous activity, that it's actually something fun, that it's a nice thing to do. So it's not just school or something like that. So that's the Gemara's question. What is this extra emphasis on Purim when really this is a universal rule for all Jewish holidays? Yes, Rita.
So, on Pesach and Sukkot, right, we read the Torah that we read. We sort of suspend the usual Torah reading, and we read a particular part of the Torah that talks about, Pesach, that talks about Sukkot. I'm trying to think about Shavuot. If we, but for Purim, we don't do that. And in fact, the Megillah isn't even sort of part of our regular cycle of reading. So I think that that's interesting. If I'm trying to, I don't know historically when this discussion took place relative to sort of the codification of what became sort of the regular reading. But that wouldn't have happened on Shabbat, that there wouldn't have been something to read about Purim on Shabbat.
There is a reading for Purim. It's the reading of destroying Amalek. So there is a special Torah reading for Purim. And the question is, would they read that on that Shabbat? Is a good question. But I want to distinguish between the same way I distinguish the tikkun, the studying of Torah on Shavuot is different than the ritual of reading the Torah on Shavuot, which is specific. There's a Torah reading of the Ten Commandments, getting the Torah. So that these are separate things. There's one thing which is the ritualistic recitation of Torah, and what they're talking about is studying Torah, asking questions, propounding sermons and public teachings for people to be edified by, and so on and so forth. So that's what they're talking about here, and it's that, and they distinguish it as being very different from the pro forma recitation of the words of the Torah. So, so that's the Gemara's question. What did Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi add that we don't know already, that you're supposed to have this other dimension besides the ritual dimension? So we're on 4A2. Did I finish discussing the parts that I wanted to say? Yes. Good. 4A2.
Rabbi, just one quick question. You mentioned something about the joy of learning.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you get that differentiated from the obligation of learning?
Say more about
from the text.
Because the obligation, where does the obligation come from? The obligation comes from the fact that you need to celebrate a holiday. So the idea that they say part of celebrating the holiday is that you should study is to make an assumption that if you study, you're not going to be turning the holiday into a day of mourning, into a day of suffering. It's in keeping with the spirit of the holiday. All of these, the point of celebrating all these holidays, there's an obligation for each one of these holidays, v'samachta b'chagecha, that these are holidays, meaning festivals, meaning times of joy. Each one of these holidays are holidays that you're obligated, however paradoxical that may sound, you're obligated to be happy. And that's where Moses says, so part of that celebration is you must do it this way. So in addition to everything else, in addition to having the meal, in addition to other ways that you're going to be able to celebrate, but adding study to your joy is what Moses is doing, and he's saying that it follows. He's saying that it simply logically follows one from the other. So now we're turning the page. We're on 482. The Gemara answers.
The Gemara answers, it was necessary for Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi to teach this rule regarding Purim, because you might have said that on Shabbat we should prohibit lectures on the Megillah because of the edict cited by Rabbah below. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi therefore informs us that no such prohibition is enacted.
Okay, so the answer that the Gemara gives is, but we're talking about a very specific situation. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is talking about this paradoxical situation that it's Purim, but it's not Purim. And we have actually taken away the reading of the Megillah on this Shabbat. So perhaps when we take away the reading of the Megillah on this Shabbat, we're taking away the entire status of Purim from that Shabbat, and therefore you shouldn't be studying the Megillah on that Shabbat, because the reading of the Megillah has been deferred to a different day. So that's not the same thing on Pesach, on Sukkot, and Shavuot. If it's on Shabbos, it's still on Shabbos. So the idea is that those holidays have their integrity. They're preserved in their essence, and any time that they happen, you need to be engaged in the various ways of observing them. But he's talking about this very, very specific weird situation where the date says it's Purim, but we have decided not to read the Megillah on Purim. So if we don't read the Megillah on Purim, maybe we've completely canceled the nature of Purim for that day. The way that the Gemara says that is where it says, because you might have said, Nigzor mishum de Rabba, that we should make a decree, a prohibition, because of Rabbah. So Rabbah is below. Rabbah will be mentioned a little later. So take a look at 13, note 13.
According to Rabbah, the rabbis banned the reading of the Megillah on the Shabbat because one might carry a Megillah scroll for Amos in a Reshus Harabim, a biblical violation.
Reshus Harabim. If we're gonna mispronounce it, then let's mispronounce it the correct way. So it's Reshus Harabim.
Reshus Harabim, a biblical violation. Here, the Gemara suggests that even lecturing about the Megillah on Shabbat ought to be forbidden to safeguard this prohibition against reading the Megillah on the Shabbat.
Okay, so later on, just as a spoiler alert, later on we're going to find out that what was the whole point of not reading the Megillah on Shabbat? The point was that we were worried that somebody would not know how to read the Megillah, but they would have a Megillah, and then they would take the Megillah and carry it in the public domain on Shabbat to bring it to some place where it could be read properly. So the rabbis decided, no, Shabbat is sacrosanct, and therefore we're not going to tempt people into possibly transgressing a prohibition of Shabbat and desecrating Shabbat, and therefore we're not going to make people read the Megillah on Shabbat. It's just going to lead to trouble. So we'll put it off to another day. So I can see that some people think that that's a little over the top. We will find out later on, of course, that this is the same basis for why we do not, for instance, this year, blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah when it falls on Shabbat. Because a person might say, wait, I have a shofar, but I really can't blow it. So let me take it over to so-and-so's house, and they'll show me how to blow it, or they'll blow it for me because I really want to hear shofar. It's a mitzvah. So as a result, they will transgress a prohibition of the Torah, and the mitzvah that they perform will be at the expense of a transgression. Mitzvah haba'a ba'avera eina mitzvah. A mitzvah that is performed by means of a transgression, it does not count as a mitzvah. So the ends do not justify the means. So that's the point. And when we get to that discussion, we can get more into it about whether it makes any sense or not. What's the rationale? What does it tell us about the rabbi's priorities? What does it tell us about the rabbi's concern for Shabbat itself? All of these things are super relevant to our own time and our own situation right now. But we're going to defer that to when we get to 4b. Right now, what we're just simply focusing on is that if we accept that that's what has been decided, then the question is, what about all these other activities? Do we mandate these other activities to take place on Shabbat, or will they also lead to Shabbat desecration? So, for instance, if somebody's going to lecture on the Megillah, is somebody going to bring a Megillah book with them on Shabbat, and will therefore be encouraging people to transgress when we don't want them to do so? The value that this upholds, just a little bit to get into it, is based on something we read a couple of weeks ago in the Holiness Code in the Torah, where we are told how to be holy. And one of the things that we're told is, do not put a stumbling block in front of the blind, right? Don't trip up a blind person. So, of course, literally, we can picture what that is, and people, love to play tricks on unsuspecting people, and the cruelty that people sometimes engage in by taking advantage of people, is pretty disgusting. And that's certainly one of the things that the Torah is telling us to avoid. But the rabbis extended this much, much more broadly. And what they said is being blind means being vulnerable, not quite seeing what's at stake, not quite seeing how you're really supposed to go forward. And then somebody else taking advantage of your ignorance or your vulnerability, your fragility, and making you fail, just for the purpose of making you fail. So classic examples are: do not put alcohol in front of an alcoholic. The alcoholic is blind in the sense that they have a weakness that they are struggling to control, and they can't necessarily control themselves. So that's the blindness, so to speak. So don't push their vulnerability by tempting them. If a person has other kinds of weaknesses, you don't put that temptation in front of them. So here it's a very interesting temptation. What's the temptation that the rabbis are worried about that we might be placing in front of this quote unquote vulnerable blind person that we're prohibited from placing?
Well, you have an obligation. Are we talking now about carrying the Megillah?
No. What is? Yes, we're talking about carrying the Megillah, but the temptation is doing a mitzvah. That's the paradox here. The temptation is this person really wants to hear Megillah, or really wants to blow the shofar, right? Or really wants to study the Torah. So if we take advantage of their desire to do that by making them do something on Shabbat where they'll be so excited or so invested in doing that they won't pay attention to the rules that they have to because they're blind, they just see before them the possibility of doing this really nice thing, then it's our fault. This is where the rabbis are saying it's our fault if we're not seeing that this is a weakness that this person is carrying, and we don't do something about it. Then it's on us that we have caused this person to transgress, and they therefore take that responsibility very seriously, and they say, no, we have to be the ones who are going to put a fence around the Torah. We're going to be the ones who are going to protect the Torah from being violated and protect this person from unknowingly and actually out of completely good intentions violating the Torah. Right? That's what they're saying. So therefore, we're not going to mandate certain things which we know would then put people into a compromised way of doing it. So if we can stop that from happening, we will. So that's one way to read this. The way that I suggested originally was a little bit different. Was a conceptual question of what's the status of this Shabbat once we take Megillah out of it? Is it really a full-fledged Purim day anyway, since we're not really engaging in the basic essence of Purim, and therefore we really aren't necessarily then obligated to delve deeply into the meanings of Purim. Does the Purim observance depend on the reading of the Megillah, or does it depend on the date itself, right? So we're going to get into that. It's going to start getting unpacked a little bit more in that way down the line. Okay. Any other comments at this point?
I have a few
Rabbi?
comments.
Okay, hold on. First Sarita, then
Oh,
Stuart.
sorry.
Right. So, okay. So you're really inviting us to talk about this issue about the fence around the Torah thing, but we're going to talk about that later. So I'll wait.
As
But
long as you know who isn't around, we can talk about it.
Right. No, I find it really problematic because then there's also the whole issue about, creating an Eruv so that you can. And so it would seem that that there has been, people have found sort of ways to get around certain prohibitions. My thoughts here, though, are that, for Sukkot, for Pesach, there's sort of more to the holiday, if you will. So if on Sukkot, you don't, you're not going to carry your lulav, okay, but there's other stuff that sort of is what it doesn't negate the whole holiday by not having you do that. And in some sense, it does negate the whole holiday of Purim if you can't read the Megillah. So, I'm looking at this as, but isn't this then taking away the possibility of celebrating the holiday when that in fact seems to be so much what the holiday is all about, that mitzvah is so inextricable to it? What do you have left?
So let's understand that a couple of modifications here. We're not taking away reading the Megillah, period. We're moving it to another day. So the reading of the Megillah will happen. And that's what I'm suggesting is part of our problem now. How do we then consider the day that we're reading the Megillah versus the date when we would have read the Megillah, which is the date that says the calendar says is Purim, but we're not reading the Megillah. That's what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is saying. That's part of what he's saying. We're going to read the Megillah. We're not taking that practice out of circulation, but we're just putting it on another day. That's number one. Number two, what you're bringing up is another question which we're going to eventually start unpacking, down the line here in a few more after a few more teachings, and that is, let's not reduce Purim to just reading the Megillah. There are 4 mitzvot in Purim, and unfortunately, 3 of them don't get the same play as reading the Megillah itself or listening to the Megillah. And certainly one of them, the tradition says, is of paramount importance. Next to reading the Megillah, it's just as important, and it's not necessarily something that anybody pays attention to. The 4 mitzvot on Purim are reading the Megillah, having a Purim Su'udah, a festive meal. That comes back to the idea that we're making this into a happy time, and we're supposed to have meals. We make Kiddush on Sukkot and Shavuot and Pesach. We don't make Kiddush on Purim, but we are mandated to actually have a festive meal in the daytime, not at night when everybody sort of focuses on celebrating Purim. But actually, the day of Purim is supposed to be the major focus of our celebrations. And then we have 2 other mitzvot. Right? Does anybody want to chime in? What are the other 2 basic mitzvot for Purim?
Well, giving food and gifts and such, right? Is that
to whom?
To needy?
So there are 2 mitzvot. One is to give presents of food to our friends, right? To people that we want to give them a gift and be nice to. That's one. And the other is a special mitzvah of matanot le'evyonim, of giving gifts, which is not necessarily food, but actually, just give me the cash, lady. Just give me the cash. Of giving tzedakah to poor people. And the tradition says very, very clearly, and that the mitzvah of giving tzedakah to poor people is absolutely on the top of the list. If you have a certain budget of how much money you want to spend to celebrate Purim, how many people are we going to invite to have a meal together? How many different bags of whatever it is are we going to give out to everybody? And how much money are we going to give to the poor? So Maimonides and everybody is in agreement, says that your joy cannot be at the expense of somebody else's joy. So if there are poor people, they must be taken care of first, and then you celebrate in your own way, whatever your means are. But if you have a limited budget, if you only have $10, then That $10 has to be divided up mostly to the poor, and then the rest of it for your own gifts to your friends. So, so these are essential mitzvot, and that means that the quality of the day of Purim is not limited to just reading the Megillah. In fact, reading the Megillah takes whatever it is, a half hour. If you go into very traditional neighborhoods, the Megillah has been finished long ago, in the morning minyan. The rest of the day is running around and singing and dancing and having parties, and the kids are going crazy and so on. It's carnival. That's actually what Purim is supposed to be. So, taking the Megillah away is not as total an erasure of the day as it might possibly be thought of. Okay, but we're going to get to those other things again later. Let's now continue. Another teaching.
Okay, I'm not going to. Well, I was going to make some points about the.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
About the well, I'll hold my fire on the fence and just why I think this fence is particularly incoherent. But just to point out, I mean, this whole tractate is called called Megillah. It's not called Purim. I don't know where all these other Purim mitzvot come from. Whether they're discussed in this tractate, maybe in a different tractate, but. Yeah, so, the focus, I mean, if we just go by the title of this tractate, it sure causes you to think that Megillah is the central mitzvah of the Hag. But
so we did talk about this a number of times, and it's good to point it out again, just to appreciate it. That's part of this amazing creation, that we decided that the Megillah of Esther is part of the Torah, and therefore, everything in that Megillah then becomes meaningful. So if the Megillah tells us that we have to give gifts to the poor, that becomes a mitzvah on Purim, because it's in the Megillah. So yes, the Megillah, of course, is the foundation for all of this. If we didn't have the Megillah, we wouldn't have a holiday of Purim. But the ritual recitation of the Megillah was what I'm arguing is not the be-all and end-all. It doesn't exhaust the celebration of the day. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. So the Gemara answers?
No, we did the Gemara answer.
For Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi to teach this ruling regarding Purim.
We read that. You read it.
Sorry.
You personally read it.
Another teaching from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi?
Yeah, take away the colon and put in a question mark.
Another teaching from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi?
I'm joking. Yes, here's another one. We're on a roll. Remember, this is the way this is organized. A whole long chain of teachings by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi about Purim. Go ahead.
Okay. And he also said, a person is obligated to read the Megillah on the night of Purim and repeat it on the day of Purim. As it is said, "Oh my God, I call out by day and you do not answer, by night and there is no respite for me."
Okay.
Students who heard this.
Wait. Enough. So first, let's understand, or let's at least provisionally, we're going to get to this discussion in a second. He's telling us now about observance of Purim. He says you have to read the Megillah at night and repeat in the day. The word in the statement that he says is velishnota. So that word velishnota is going to become the subject now of some discussion. We have that word in the first paragraph of the Shema, right? Veshinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam. Take these words, right? Place them on your heart, that you should love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Take these words and put them on your heart, and put them on your doorposts, and wrap them around your arm, and put them between your on your head, between your eyes, and vishinantam levanecha, and teach them diligently to your children. So the word there is vishinantam. So that's the word that's here as well. The word shin nun hey, that's the root, And that root has a number of different associations to it. One of them is the word sheni, right? It's the second, right? So shnayim is two, right? So vishinantam, that's why it's translated, teach them diligently, review the lessons, teach it to them again and again and again, repeat, do this again. We also have the word used, for instance, in the title of the rabbinic book of teachings, which is called the Mishnah. We have it in the Torah itself. The book of Deuteronomy is called Mishneh HaTorah Hazot, the repetition or the second Torah. So this is this word to repeat. And what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi seems to be saying is not only do we have a reading of the Megillah at night, but there's more. And the question will be what that more is. But he also gives us a proof text. And that proof text is very paradoxical, right? That proof text comes from Psalms, right? If I'm not mistaken, Psalms 23, right? And it says, God, I cry out to you, right? And you don't seem to be answering me. And at night, I cry out to you. And there seems to be no either silence or no rest, no time when I can't let up. I have to keep on calling out to you. So this verse is actually a verse of desperation, right? Purim is a happy holiday because we have a happy ending. But this moment that the verse is talking about is when a person is in terrible trouble and they don't seem to be getting any answer. They don't seem to be getting the rescue, the help, the salvation that they're praying for. So we'll have to come back to that in a second, because of course with Purim we did. That's what we're celebrating. We're celebrating the fact that God did answer our prayers, even though it doesn't say that God did so. Okay, so there's some kind of ambiguous kind of teaching. What does it mean, repeat it in the day? And why is he using a verse that tells us specifically about somebody who is so in trouble that day and night they're praying, but they can't get any help? Okay. Savur mina. So now the Talmud goes into how people started trying to understand this. The students.
The students who heard this ruling understood it to mean that one is obligated to read Megillah at night and to learn its Mishnah, that is the Mishnayot of Tractate Megillah, by day.
Okay.
Rabbi.
Oh, wait. So let's understand now how the first supposition of that the Talmud reports.
Okay.
The way they are understanding it is that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is telling us that there are two practices that we have to engage in. At night, we read the Megillah, and then vilishnota bayom is not to read likrot Megillah, not to read the Megillah, but to study the Megillah, right? To diligently study the Megillah. The best way to do that is, of course, through this very tractate of Megillah. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. It means to study all of the aspects of the observance of the day and what does the Megillah mean and all of that stuff. So this is in a certain sense related back to his earlier teaching, right? What was his earlier teaching that we just asked, why is it so necessary? Where he says, besides reading the Megillah, you also have to study the Megillah. You have to study Purim. On Purim itself, you need to study about it. But if it's on Shabbos, when Purim falls out on Shabbos, don't do it. But otherwise, the implication is that, of course, you have to keep on studying about Purim. Part of the observance of Purim is to study about Purim. So now what he's telling you is, apparently, this is what the students first think. This is how we divide it up. At night, we read the Megillah, and in the day, we do our studying of the Megillah. This dichotomy is known as the famous dichotomy between the written law and the oral law. Once the Megillah is canonized as a piece of Torah, then reading the Megillah is reading the written law, is reading Torah shebichtav, is reading scripture. So that's scripture. And then in the daytime, we're involved in the oral law, in interpretation, in asking questions, in understanding the underlying assumptions, in making theories, and so on. So that's the original understanding that people had of this statement by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. And now we'll see that it's challenged. Rabbi Yirmiyah.
Rabbi Yirmiyah said to them, "It has been explained to me personally by Rabbi Hia bar Abba that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi meant that one has to repeat the Megillah. As people say, I will finish this section and then repeat it."
Okay, so now he's changing our understanding of the word lishnota. The word lishnota doesn't mean to study diligently. It means to do it again. To whatever it is that you did before, that exact thing, do again. So it's not about studying. It's not about the idea that you read the Megillah at night and then you study the underlying ideas in the daytime. But he is telling us very simply something that we have today as our own practice, that it's not enough to read the Megillah at night. It has to be read in the daytime as well. Okay, something again that is not as popular, but what he's saying is that yes, we have to read the Megillah night and day, which is what we do in our community, in all traditional communities. Okay, so the word has been changed. Its meaning has been changed into absolutely repeated. Okay, this of course has led to all kinds of discussions. There's probably, let's look at, for instance, let's look at note 15.
As a remembrance of the events recorded in the Megillah when the Jews cried out for deliverance by day and by night, according to Rashi. The authorities discuss whether the requirement to read the Megillah at night is an essential part of the original enactment mandated in the Megillah itself, or if it was ordained by the sages at a later date.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Even
though the blessing of Shehechianu is recited at the nighttime Megillah reading, it is nevertheless recited again prior to the daytime reading, for the main reading is the one that takes place during the day. Tosafot. Rambam, however, rules that the blessing of Shehechianu is not repeated by day. See Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch rules like Rambam, and Rama adopts the view of Tosafot.
Okay, so what is this? What this is indicating to us is, as the tradition keeps on going, how do we understand this idea that we have to read the Megillah at night and in the daytime? What is the force of his teaching to say that? Right. Once we agree that he's actually mandating two readings and not one reading at night and then studying in the daytime. The implication of the first understanding is there's one obligation to read the Megillah, and it's at night. When Purim starts, that's when we read the Megillah. But actually, in the Megillah itself, basing our understanding of how to observe the holiday on the words of the Megillah itself, it doesn't tell us explicitly to read the Megillah at night, and it talks more about the day being the day of celebration for all of those other mitzvot that we talked about a second ago, about the gifts and the Seudah and so on. That happens in the daytime. So subsequent thinkers started wondering if maybe Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is not telling us that the main mitzvah is to read the Megillah at night. What he's saying is that you have to read the Megillah even at night. The main reading of the Megillah is in the daytime. But you should read the Megillah at night as well. And that sheds light on why he quotes that verse that we had before. The verse that he cites, that we paid attention to, is, God, I called out to you night and day and you didn't answer me. Right? So that's a paradoxical verse to call out, to cite. If he's saying, therefore, we should read the Megillah. The Megillah is about celebrating salvation. It's not about desperation. The answer is no. But in order to appreciate the salvation, we need to appreciate the desperation that we were rescued from. And that's why we have to recite the Megillah at nighttime as well, to have that praise of God's salvation in the darkest time, to recognize that the Jews were really, really in trouble. They were fasting and they were praying and they were tearing their clothes, and they were really at the brink of thinking that they were going to be destroyed, exterminated. So we have to put that in. It's not simply, oh, let's have a fun time and let's just think about what a comedy this is, but rather let's think about also that this is really a rescue out of the most deep despair that we were involved in. So that's why we have to read it at night. So the status now is, how do we evaluate which reading is essential? Are they equal? Is one more primary than the other? And that's where you have a difference of opinion amongst the various commentators. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is adding the reading at night to the established reading in the daytime, is what one side argues. Therefore, the real reading is in the daytime, but we're tagging on another reading, and we say Shechianu at night because that's the first time that we're reading the Megillah. So therefore, we should say Shechianu for a first time. That's a celebration. But the real time that we're supposed to say Shechianu is in the daytime, and therefore we say Shechianu again. In other mitzvot that get repeated, for instance, lulav. Once we say Shechianu for taking a lulav on the first day of Sukkot, we don't say Shechianu when we take lulav again, because we already celebrated taking the lulav. But with Purim, with reading the Megillah, we have this unusual example of saying Shechianu both at night and in the daytime. So that's the explanation. The explanation is actually the Shechianu started in the daytime. But then Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, but you know what? Let's add that cognizance of how deeply we were in trouble and how miraculous it was to be able to get out of it, even in the nighttime. And therefore, we add the Shechianu at night. Maimonides reads it the opposite way. Maimonides reads it, no. What Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is always telling us is that as soon as Purim comes in, that's when we're obligated to read the Megillah. That's at night. The night precedes the day. That's our first reading. That's our main reading. So therefore, that's when we say Shechianu. And then the next day, we have to read it again. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, let's keep on reading it because we need to understand that this has been a continuous process of redemption. But nevertheless, it's a secondary reading, and we've already said Shechianu. So that's Maimonides' point of view. And what we have basically is we have a split between Spanish authorities or Oriental authorities and Ashkenazi authorities. The Oriental authorities, meaning Maimonides and then Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Shulchan Aruch, who follows, are from they're from Spain and going into North Africa and then into Israel and beyond. The Shulchan Aruch is written in the land of Israel by Yosef Karo, who was a Sephardi. He says, no, actually the nighttime reading is the main reading, and the secondary reading is the reading in the daytime, and we don't say Shechianu. Tosfot, who are from Northern Europe, from France and Germany, the descendants of Rashi, and then the Ramah, who is the rabbi who added to the Shulchan Aruch the views of the Ashkenazi rabbis. They're of the opinion, no, the opposite. The main reading is the daytime reading, and the evening reading was added as a secondary reading, but since it comes first, because the night comes before the day, it gets a Shechianu, but the main reading is in the daytime, and that's the Shechianu. Of course, in terms of phenomenologically speaking, in terms of our community experience, now we think of the nighttime reading as the main reading in our community. That's where people show up mostly. And reading in the morning is a much more secondary thing. But it's not simply because we have this halachic dispute. It's not that's not why Shomrei people are not showing up in the morning. Not because they're all agreeing with the Sephardim, right? The reality of celebrating Purim, on a regular weekday in a regular society, is a challenging proposition. And the daytime celebrations are more difficult than the nighttime celebration. Okay, so that's where we stopped at the top of 4A2. Now we're up to the third line on the right-hand column. This ruling.
This ruling of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi was stated also by a different Amora. Rav Chelbo said, in the name of Ula from Biri, a person is obligated to read the Megillah on the night of Purim and repeat it on the day of Purim. As it is said, so that my soul might sing to you and not be stilled. Hashem, my God, forever will I thank you.
Okay, so that my soul may sing to you and not be stilled, my God, forever will I thank you. How does that verse seem relevant to you? How does that verse, this is the proof text for this statement. So how is it trying to tell us to read this verse? How do we have to squeeze out this teaching into this verse?
Well, it's
okay. Wait, let Lynn start first. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
It reminds me of the proof text for the previous one. We need to keep saying it so that we're not silent, so that we may continue to praise him and thank him for rescuing us, like he did in the.
So there's phrases here that are or there's one phrase, that one word that sort of echoes in both. There's a similarity, as you're saying, but there's also a difference, a basic difference. The basic difference, anybody want to say before Sarita said, unless you want to point this out, what's the basic difference between the first verse that was cited by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi and this verse? On its own,
Rabbi,
if we read the two verses, there's a big difference between these two verses.
Right. So the first verse, I mean, this one's all about joy.
Exactly.
The first one is about not being answered. So this is like, we're so joyous that we just haven't been able to express it enough, and we need to keep on saying it the next day. And the other is, no, I tried to say it and you didn't listen to me, so I'm going to say it again. So very, very different point of view. Right.
They're opposites in many ways. There's a contrast here. There's total desperation in the first verse, that I'm calling out to you, I'm calling out to you, I'm calling out to you. I never hear from you. I keep on calling out to you night and day. That's the first verse. And the second verse is, I can't stop thanking you. I cannot take a pause from being grateful and praising you because of how wonderful you have been. So, hopefully this is a chronological thing. This desperation is before the rescue has arrived, before the salvation has come about. And then after the salvation has come about, we have this joy and this celebration that is just unstoppable. So they're mirror images of each other. The word that is similar is yidom or dumiyah, right? Which is in the second verse, L'man yizamercha chavod velo yidom, Shem Elokai le'olam odeka. And in the other verse, the verse that was first cited is Elokai ekra yomam velo taneh v'layla velo dumiyah li. Right? So there's dumiyah and yidom. They're from the same root, to be stilled, to be silenced. And in the first one, it is, I have no respite, I have no rest. I just constantly have to call out to you, and the line is busy. I'm never getting through. And in the second one, it is that I will never be silent and never take a rest from thanking you. I just can't get over how grateful I am. So those are the two mirror images. In what sense then are we talking about reading the Megillah day and night? How does this apply then to teaching us that we need to read the Megillah day and night?
Well, it is both. So the story is that we were almost defeated, we were almost wiped out, but we weren't. So, and then the second one, as you said, is a thankful that we were not, thankful that you saved us. So it's, I the laws of Judaism seem to, many of them, be about, well, just in case we'll do this too, right? So like a system of checks and balances in the law so that we as human beings who err so much don't mess up. So we're thanking you, well, we're saying without end, please help us because we were almost destroyed, but then we're saying without end, thank you because we weren't destroyed.
So I want to just distinguish when it's not a just in case. The second verse is, I can't stop myself. I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, and I want to say it all the time. The day and night is implicit. The day and night is mentioned in the first verse that was cited. When I'm not getting an answer from you, I'm calling out to you in the daytime. I'm calling out to you at night. I'm never getting an answer. Right there, the night and day is explicit. In the celebration part, there is no mention of day and night. It's just saying I'm never going to stop. I'm never going to stop. So then the implication is night and day. I'm never going to stop thanking you. What this also indicates is that reading the Megillah is praising God. Right? This proof text says, I will praise you so that my soul may sing to you and not be still. I will forever thank you. And that verse is now used as the basis for saying, therefore, we need to read the Megillah day and night. In other words, reading the Megillah is thanking God. So again, not an obvious proposition. God is never mentioned in the Megillah. We get all, caught up in the shenanigans of the story and in the ins and outs, and all of that is great. And what this is saying is there's an overlay or an underlying consciousness that we need to apply here, which is to read this story of absurdity and relief from the perspective of thanks to God. That is unceasing. So that's why we need to read it both day and night. Reading this weird story and putting you at the center of it or at the base of it is what we have to do. We can't stop ourselves from doing it. Therefore, we read it day and night. The implication for what we were discussing just a minute ago in each of these is maybe, again, relevant. Is the day the main thing or is the night the main thing? Right? Which one is, where do we start from? Right? So in the verse that we had first, right, it says, oh my God, I call out by day and you do not answer, by night and there is no respite for me. So it starts with the day and then it mentions the night, right? Of course, there is no mention of day or night in the second verse, which talks about thanking God and celebrating God. But what it says is, I'm going to say thank you, and then I'm just not going to stop. I can't stop myself. I just have to keep on saying it. So where does the beginning come from? The night, right? And not the day. The reason that we're doing it in the day is because we just can't stop ourselves. It's not enough. What was the name of that book? Once is not enough, right? So that's part of what the implication might be in terms of which one gets the priority, or which one gets to be seen as the more important reading.
Can I ask a question, Rabbi?
Yeah.
We're talking about Psalms that are seven Psalms apart. Is there some sort of a historic, is there something happening in the development of Psalms that changes the tone of them? I see that Rabbi, what's his name? This is the one who's here, Helbo, obviously is he from a different period or is he contemporaneous with Yehoshua?
He's Babylonian. They're contemporaneous. He's Babylonian, and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is Palestinian. Is in the land of Israel. So they're saying the same thing at the same time from two different angles, using two different verses, and they're in two different places. But your question about the Psalms, I don't think the short answer is no. The Psalms go back and forth between different kinds of emotions and situations. Some of them are, deep calls of anguish, and other ones are absolutely joyous, exultant calls of celebration and joy, and everything in between. So the Psalms, I don't think, have that kind of organizing principle at all. But what I do want to mention, and it's mentioned in the notes, this psalm is a psalm that we recite every day. It's Psalm 30, right? Yeah. Note 19. It's Psalm 30. It's Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid. So the psalm is attributed specifically to David, and we are applying it here to reading the Megillah. So you could say, okay, so they're simply taking the principle that's mentioned there about continuous thanking to God and applying it. But actually, in the Midrash, that is what is being alluded to in this teaching. Earlier teachings actually apply that entire psalm to the Purim story, and they read verse by verse in that psalm as being a kind of a step-by-step part of the story of the unfolding of the salvation of the Jews, and of Mordechai and Esther and Haman's struggles with each other. And this verse is mentioned is put in the mouth of Haman, and this verse is in the mouth of Esther, and so on. So there are other midrashim which actually completely analyze the entire psalm as appropriate to telling the story of Purim. Clearly, the psalm says it has nothing to do with Purim. It's ascribing itself to David, who lived hundreds and hundreds of years before the Purim story could ever have even happened, if it did. And so this is a midrashic exercise that the rabbis loved to engage in, where they took words of scripture that have a completely different context in their original, and they apply it to subsequent situations. Sinatra sang it, really.
Yeah.
What did he sing? I'm not making the connection.
Rabbi?
So David put up that in the chat. So here they take an ancient psalm, and they say, look at how it lines up so beautifully with what happened centuries later in the story of Purim, and therefore this is the last verse of the psalm. The last verse, the happy ending is, okay, so now let's thank God again and again unceasingly. Let's read the Megillah as much as we can, day and night.
Rabbi? It's
Night and day. There you go. Okay. Night and day.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, Josie.
It says in my Jewish study Bible that another view is this is a psalm referring to Hanukkah.
Right, because the superscription, the title of the psalm is that it's the dedication of the house. This is Moshe Chanukat Habayit LeDavid, and we actually have a custom to read this psalm not only as part of the regular prayers, but on Hanukkah we read it as an extra psalm every day because it's appropriate for Hanukkah. But now what the Talmud is and what the earlier Midrash is saying is that this applied even before Hanukkah to Purim. Okay.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay. So now we're going to begin a whole new topic. You can see that there's a little break in the printing on page 4A2 in the middle of the right-hand column. And we're going to get into a long discussion, which we're not going to be able to complete today. But we'll see that there's some interesting stuff here. Interesting to me, anyway.
The Gemara quotes from the Mishnah, except that the residents of villages may at times advance the date for reading the Megillah to the day of assembly.
So we note that what we have here now is a heading from the Mishnah. In other words, the way that we've organized the Gemara is, okay, we finished talking about the stuff that we talked about until now. And now we're going to the next phrase in the Mishnah, and we're going to start writing commentary. We're going to start discussing the next phrase in the Mishnah. So the topic supposedly that we finished discussing is the multiple dates that were possibly given over to the reading of the Megillah, and saying you could read it on that day and on that day and on that day and so on and so forth, right? And now we're saying that we're going to the next line in the Mishnah. So just to review what that is, I want to get it here to where they're at. Yeah, so this is the way the Mishnah reads, just as a review. This is 2a1. The Megillah is read on the 11th of Adar, on the 12th, on the 13th, on the 14th, on the 15th, not earlier than the 11th, not later than the 15th. Residents of cities that were surrounded by walls at the time of Yehoshua ben Nun read the Megillah on the 15th. Residents of villages and large towns read the Megillah on the 14th, except that the residents of villages, that means the ones who are supposed to read it on the 14th, may at times advance the date for reading the Megillah to the day of assembly. Okay, so that's the Yom HaKnisa. That's the quote that we are looking at now. So the Gemara now asks the simple question: why did we make such an allowance? We've never heard of such a thing ever before. What's the point? Go ahead.
The Gemara gives the reason for this leniency. Rabbi Chanina said, the sages were lenient with regard to villages and allowed their residents to advance the date of reading to the preceding day of assembly, so that they will be available on the 14th of Adar to provide water and food for the Purim feast of their brethren who reside in the towns.
Okay, so this is the setup that we need to start trying to work out and imagine. These are the villagers, right? They don't live in big concentrations of other Jews, and they are going to be allowed now to not read the Megillah on the 14th, but to, when they come into the big city on market day, they can read the Megillah on market day when they come into the big city, and therefore they won't have to read it on the 14th. And we've been talking about this now for some time. Part of this has to do with the fact that maybe they can't read the Megillah. They don't know how to read the Megillah. Now we have another statement. We actually had it on the first page of the Gemara, but now we're diving into it. That this special leniency was given to the villagers so that they will be available on the 14th to provide water and food for the Purim feasts of their brethren who reside in the towns. The towns are the bigger communities, the communities that are not given this leeway to read on any other day. They have to read on the 14th. So now let's come back to what I mentioned earlier, that celebrating Purim, only one of the aspects is reading the Megillah. The rest of it is to have a feast and to give gifts and so on and so forth. So that's a whole, actually a very commercially active day, where there's a lot of stuff being consumed and exchanged and transferred from one person to another. So according to this explanation by Rabbi Chanina, there's an advantage to letting the villagers, the outlying people, not read Megillah on the 14th, because if they read earlier, then they're available, they're free on the 14th to be what we would call today the essential workers, right? They are now open to be able to bring in the vegetables and the provisions and all of the other stuff to make it available for the townsfolk who have to read the Megillah on the 14th, and therefore who have to have other obligations to take care of. We should understand that when people live in villages at that time, and all around the world, in agrarian societies, when you have a farm, you don't necessarily live in the middle of your wheat field. Your house is not necessarily in the middle of all your fields. A lot of times you live in a small cluster of dwellings, and that's the village. And then you go out to your fields to take care of planting and harvesting and whatever else to maintain your holdings. So villages were a standard way of farmers to create a support system. In Israel, we have the kibbutz, we have the moshav, where there's a collective living area, and then the fields are on the outskirts. So that's the idea here. These are the villagers who basically are the farmers, and then on the 14th, when people need to have their parties and so on, as Seward says, now we've got freely available labor for the catering and for the for the provisioning, for the food deliveries, and for all of that stuff. So that's why they allowed the farmers, the villagers, to get away with reading the Megillah at some other time. Okay, we're gonna start with 4b1 next time, where the Gemara is not so comfortable with that suggestion, and they reorient how to understand what the rabbis were doing. And I think it also, we'll see, I think that it's relevant to how we see essential workers in general today. Something to think about, right? The paradox of our present moment, where we call people essential workers, but they're basically, which sounds very important, and yet in terms of how society actually treats essential workers and values essential workers are usually at the bottom of the totem pole. So we have a very kind of contradictory message that we're putting out there, or certainly the way that we exist, the privileged of us, which is most of us here. We have people that we totally depend on, but we're very comfortable with them being very subordinate to us. So we'll get back to that next time we learn, God willing, next Sunday. Okay? Shkoach. Thank you to everybody.